George Patton called it a horse race to the last big town and bet 650 men on it. August 1943. The BBC was broadcasting that his soldiers were eating grapes and swimming while the British did the real fighting. Patton wanted Messina before Montgomery got there, and he didn't care who told him to wait. His corps commander said, "Wait." His division commander said, "Wait." The nearest friendly infantry was 10 miles from the beach. Patton drove to the command post in person, got in his division commander's face, and shouted the words, "No subordinate forgets." "Are you afraid to fight?" The division commander, Bradley and Truscott, one of the toughest generals in the American Army, told Patton he could hand the division to someone else. Patton didn't flinch. Same battalion, same commander, same trick that had worked flawlessly 3 days before. 650 men loaded onto landing craft that evening, 15 mules carrying every round of ammunition they'd have, 1 cruiser for fire support, and a 10-mile gap between them and the nearest friendly rifle. The mules wouldn't survive the morning. The cruiser would leave 3 times, and the air support those men begged for would bomb their own command post. If you find stories like this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the bell. We have much more coming for you. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. On the night of August 7th, 3 days before Patton's blow-up at Truscott's command post, Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard's 2nd Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, had climbed into landing craft off the north coast of Sicily and gone ashore behind German lines at Sant'Agata. The target was the San Fratello Ridge, where the 29th Panzergrenadier Division had been stalling the American advance along Highway 113 for days. Bernard's roughly 650 men landed without a shot fired. Complete surprise. The Germans on the San Fratello line hadn't expected a hook from the sea, and the bulk of Truscott's division was close enough, just a few miles west, to push through and link up within hours. By morning, the coastal highway was cut, the German position was flanked, and 1,500 prisoners were in American hands. 12 miles gained in one night. Bernard's men didn't lose a single soldier on the beach. Patton loved it. And if you're Patton in August 1943, that success doesn't teach you caution. It teaches you the trick works. Now, the context. Patton wasn't just racing the clock, he was racing Montgomery. The British 8th Army was grinding its way up Sicily's east coast, fighting through the volcanic terrain around Mount Etna, and the BBC was making sure everyone heard about it. American troops, according to British broadcasters, were having an easy time of it, swimming, eating grapes, strolling through western Sicily while Montgomery's men did the hard fighting against real German opposition. The broadcasts reached every Allied soldier on the island, American and British alike. The sting was worse because it came from an Allies' microphone, not an enemy's. And behind that insult sat a deeper wound, Kasserine Pass. 5 months earlier, the U.S. Army had been routed in Tunisia, the worst American ground defeat since the war began. Patton himself had been brought in to salvage 2 corps from that disaster. He'd done it. He'd whipped the corps back into shape, driven the 7th Army across western Sicily, and taken Palermo in 11 days. He'd turned the American soldiers' reputation from a question mark into something the Germans took seriously. And the BBC was still talking about Americans on vacation. So Messina wasn't just a city at the tip of an island, it was proof. 1st Army into Messina writes the record of who won Sicily and who carried the load. Patton intended to write that record, and Montgomery wasn't going to beat him to it. After Bernard's success at San Fratello, General Walter Free's 29th Panzergrenadier Division had pulled back to a new defensive line along the Naso Ridge, running south from Cape Orlando through the village of Naso. Same kind of position, high ridges, blown bridges, extensive minefields, a single coastal highway squeezed between mountains and the Tyrrhenian Sea. Taking it head-on would cost days Patton didn't want to spend, so Patton wanted another end run, land Bernard's battalion again, this time near the town of Brolo, 4 miles behind the new German line, seize Monte Cipolla, a steep 750-foot hill that dominated the coastal highway from both knobs of its summit, cut off Fry's escape route east, and hold until the main body of the division rolled up. Truscott, a cavalryman, a polo player who'd earned his reputation by never backing off on the field, a division commander Eisenhower had called the best he'd seen in the theater, initially agreed. The plan made sense on one condition. The 15th Infantry Regiment had to reach the Naso Ridge by the evening of August 10th, putting them close enough to link up with Bernard's force quickly after the landing. If the 15th got there, Bernard's battalion wouldn't be stranded long. When Keyes set up Bernard's task force, he'd given Truscott an explicit promise. The force would be entirely under the 3rd Division's command, and Truscott would have responsibility for the timing of any operation. That meant Truscott could pull the trigger when the conditions were right, not before. Patton had originally wanted to launch on the morning of August 10th. A Luftwaffe attack the evening before had sunk one of the LSTs earmarked for the landing, the same vessel that had already been damaged in the Sant'Agata operation, and that setback, combined with the 7th Infantry's trouble getting across the Cipolla River, had forced a 24-hour postponement. Patton accepted that delay. He wasn't in the mood to accept another one. The 15th didn't get there. By evening on August 10th, the regiment was still fighting through mined terrain and sporadic German fire west of the ridge. One battalion had pushed as far as the village of Mirto, overlooking the Cipolla, only to be pinned by fire from the far bank. The other 2 battalions didn't close into the area until 2100. No roads existed for the artillery to displace forward. Truscott's infantry was stuck over 10 miles from Bernard's intended landing site at Monte Cipolla. The gap that was supposed to be small enough to close in hours was now a full day's advance through defended ridge lines. Truscott picked up the phone and called Bradley. The picture was clear. If Bernard landed now, his force would be alone behind enemy lines with no prospect of quick relief. Every hour that gap stayed open was another hour for Fries to mass everything he had against 650 men on a hilltop. Truscott wanted 24 hours, one day. Let the 15th and 7th Infantry push through the ridge, shorten the distance, then launch the landing with the link-up already in reach. Bradley agreed. The division commander and the corps commander, both looking at the same map, both reached the same conclusion: wait one day. Bradley called Patton. Patton said no. Here's the detail that turns this from a tactical disagreement into something else. When Keyes arrived at Truscott's command post that evening to check on the planning, he told Truscott something the official Army history records without commentary. Patton had arranged for a large number of war correspondents to accompany Bernard's force on the landing. Patton, Keyes said, would not relish having to tell those reporters the operation had been postponed a second time. One cancellation was a setback. 2 cancellations in front of the press, while Montgomery's 8th Army pushed toward Messina from the south. That wasn't a military risk calculation anymore. That was reputation management. And Patton's reputation was the one thing he guarded more fiercely than any hilltop in Sicily. So the axis of Patton's decision came into focus. This wasn't about whether Bernard's battalion could hold against a Panzergrenadier Division with a 10-mile vacuum behind them. It was about whether George Patton could afford to look hesitant in front of journalists while racing Montgomery to Messina. The map said wait. The press schedule said go. Truscott tried one more time. He called Patton directly, laid out the terrain, the distances, the fact that his infantry couldn't possibly reach Bernard in time. Patton wasn't interested. "Damn it," Patton said, "the operation will go on." And then Patton got in a jeep and drove east to Terranova. Earlier that same day, Patton had erupted at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near San Stefano, an incident that would surface weeks later and come close to ending his career. He arrived at Truscott's command post, still carrying that fury, and what happened next lives in Truscott's memoir, in vivid detail. Patton was, in Truscott's words, screamingly angry as only he could be. He got in Truscott's face and delivered the line that nobody in that command post would forget. "God damn it, Lucian, what's the matter with you? Are you afraid to fight?" Picture this room. A 3-star general screaming at a 2-star general in front of staff officers with the operation already loading. Truscott, a man Eisenhower would later rank as his most capable Army commander after Patton himself, didn't step back. "General, you know that's ridiculous and insulting. You have ordered the operation, and it is now loading. If you don't think I can carry out orders, you can give the division to anyone else you please." Patton stared at him. The order stood. Truscott turned and walked back to his maps. If Patton wouldn't wait, Truscott would do the only thing left, throw every unit in the 3rd Division at the Nassau Ridge, and pray they could close that 10-mile gap before Fries destroyed Bernard. He committed the remainder of the 30th Infantry on the coastal flats, the 7th Infantry straight up the western slopes of the Nassau Ridge, the 15th Infantry swinging inland through Murto, and the recently attached 3rd Ranger Battalion to fill the gaps. Everything he had, not a reserve left. The entire division would slam into the ridge at first light to reach the men Truscott had warned Patton not to send. And if you think about what happened in that room, there's something worth sitting with. San Fratello had worked 3 days earlier. Same unit, same commander, 0 casualties on the beach. The conditions that made it work were specific. The main body was close enough to link up fast, and the Germans hadn't anticipated a seaborne hook. On August 10th, neither condition existed. The gap was 10 miles, not 3. The Germans had already been hit by one-end run and were watching the coast. Truscott knew it. Bradley knew it. Keyes almost certainly knew it. Patton knew a different thing. Last time it worked. First success is the most dangerous kind of evidence in command. It makes the next gamble feel like a repeat instead of a new bet. The terrain changes, the enemy adapts, the distances stretch. The confidence stays exactly where it was. At 1800 on August 10th, Bernard's troops finished loading near Caronia, 1 LST, 2 LCIs, 6 LCTs, covered by the cruiser USS Philadelphia, and 6 destroyers. The man leading them looked more like a college math teacher than a battalion commander. Lean, quiet, a pipe clenched between his teeth, a wisp of a mustache. Lyle Bernard had entered West Point from the enlisted ranks, called himself the Old Goat at 33, and had already pulled off one impossible landing that week. Now he was heading to another beach, 4 miles behind a German Panzergrenadier Division carrying 5 medium tanks, 8 self-propelled guns, and 15 mules loaded with every round of ammunition his men would have. Those mules were the battalion's entire ammunition train, mortar rounds, machine gun belts, everything that couldn't be carried on a man's back. No resupply convoy, no follow-on shipment. What the mules carried was what Bernard's men would fight with. The nearest friendly rifle was over 10 miles to the west. The man who'd ordered the landing was already driving back to his own headquarters. At 0243 on August 11th, 13 minutes behind schedule, Company E's 5 landing craft touched down on the beach west of Brolo. The men splashed ashore against no opposition. They cut through a double-apron barbed wire fence 20 yards inland, crossed a 13-foot railroad embankment, and cleared a lemon grove on terraced ground between the tracks and the coastal highway, capturing 10 Germans without firing a shot. The terrain rising from the beach was a patchwork of stone-walled terraces planted with lemon trees, crisscrossed by drainage ditches. Parallel to the shore, 100 yards in, the railroad embankment ran east and west like a wall, 13 feet high, with underpasses too narrow for tanks. Beyond the embankment, another 300 yards of flat ground led to the coastal highway, and beyond the highway, Monte Cipolla rose steeply to 750 feet. So far, Patton's gamble looked exactly like Sant'Agata. Companies F and G landed in the third wave at 300, followed 15 minutes later by Bernard's headquarters, Company H, and 16 DUKWs. By 0400, all 650 men were ashore, without a single casualty. Bernard had dispatched Captain Walter Miller, Truscott's liaison officer, with a powerful jeep-mounted radio to maintain a direct link back to the division command post in Terranova. That radio was Truscott's only window into what was about to happen. The tanks rolled off the LCTs and immediately hit a wall. The railroad underpasses were too narrow for a Sherman. 3 of the 5 tanks bellied, trying to cross drainage ditches on the beach side of the embankment. The last 2 were damaged, trying to knock through stone fences. They could still fire as fixed guns, but they couldn't maneuver, and a tank that can't move is a target, not a weapon. The tank platoon leader dismounted and ran west, looking for a bypass through the Naso riverbed. An engineer officer ran east and found a route through the Brolo riverbed. The self-propelled guns of the 58th Armored Field Artillery, Battery A and Battery B, 8 howitzers total, managed to work around the embankment and into firing positions in the lemon grove before daylight. Battery B covered the west approaches, Battery A the east. Companies F and G crossed the highway and started climbing Monte Cipolla by its steep northeast nose near the junction of Highway 113 and the secondary road winding up to the mountain village of Ficara. The base of the hill sat about 450 yards inland from the beach. The slopes were precipitous, loose rock, scrub brush, no cover worth the name. The only usable approach to the summit was the northeast nose itself, which was also where Polak had placed his headquarters. A German motorcycle came roaring down the highway toward Naso. The Americans froze and let it pass. They kept climbing. Then a German half-track rolled in from the west. The driver stopped, stood up in his seat to see whose troops were on the road, and 20 American riflemen opened fire. The driver slumped dead. Seconds later, a small staff car pulled up behind the half-track. A German officer stepped out to check what had happened. A bazooka round hit the car. It exploded. Every German within earshot was now awake, including Colonel Fritz Polak, commander of the 29th Artillery Regiment and the senior German officer in the Brolo area, whose headquarters sat on the very slope companies F and G were climbing. Polak gathered 15 men and opened fire downhill. Machine guns in Brolo started shooting seaward. 20mm 4-barreled anti-aircraft guns on high ground east of town raked the flats and the slopes of the hill with automatic fire. By the light of flares, Polak's people cut down several of the climbing Americans. The rest kept going. Grabbing at grass and bushes to haul themselves up the precipitous slope, they pushed through Polak's fire and reached the summit by 05:30. Within 30 minutes, both companies were dug in on the 2 small knobs that formed the top of Monte Cipolla. Polak, realizing he couldn't hold the hilltop with headquarters troops, grabbed his classified documents, including General Hube's evacuation order for the entire German force in Sicily, dated August 10th, and scrambled down the far side into Brolo. From a switchboard in town, he called General Fries. For the first time, the division commander understood that the bulk of his formation was in danger of being cut off. The coastal highway, the 29th Panzergrenadier Division's only escape route, east toward Messina, now ran directly under American guns on Monte Cipolla. Fries ordered Polak to counterattack immediately with the 1st Battalion of the 71st Panzergrenadier Regiment, the anti-aircraft unit, and a few tanks stationed east of Brolo. Down on the flats, Patton's gamble was already unraveling in a way no one at 7th Army headquarters would know about for hours. At first light, the mule train, 15 animals carrying the battalion's entire stock of mortar bombs, heavy machine gun ammunition, and 81mm rounds, started up the slope of Monte Cipolla. German fire from Brolo and the high ground east of town swept the hillside. Communication personnel and ammunition bearers trying to work the slopes went down first, about 15 men in the early morning hours alone, caught in the open on the bare rock face between the beach and the summit. Then, the mules. 13 of the 15 animals collapsed under fire. The ammunition they carried spilled across the rocks and stayed there. Nobody could retrieve it under that fire without joining it on the ground. From that point forward, Company H's mortars and machine guns on the summit were fighting on a diminishing supply that couldn't be replenished. Every burst of fire was subtracted from a total that would never be added to. and the men who needed those rounds were 750 feet above the men who couldn't bring them up. At Oro 5:30, the cruiser USS Philadelphia opened fire on prearranged targets around the beachhead. Admiral Lyle Davidson's warships had been covering the landing since the early hours, and the 6-inch shells tearing into the area east of Brolo scattered Pollack's first attempt to organize a striking force. Fries sent a truck-borne infantry column east from Cape Orlando at Oro 900. The Philadelphia spotted the vehicles and blew several apart, forcing the rest off the highway. 30 minutes later, Battery A on Monte Cipolla's flats called fire onto 2 German tanks and infantry moving along the road toward the Naso River, forcing them to detour inland. The system was working, barely, expensively, and Bernard's perimeter was holding. The German ground attacks came in 3 waves from the south, each one heavier. At Oro 700, a reconnaissance probe from Fakara, about 30 men with 2 vehicles, pushed down the secondary road toward Company G's position. Company G let the vehicles close, set them on fire with concentrated rifle shots, then hit the infantry behind them. A larger force of 30 men tried to work down the Brolo riverbed. Company G let them get deep into the channel, then dropped mortar concentrations into the gap between the high banks. The Germans broke and dragged their wounded back uphill. An hour later, the serious push came. The 6th Company of the 15th Panzergrenadier Regiment, roughly 100 men, marched down the Naso riverbed toward the western edge of Bernard's perimeter. They came boldly, in column. Company H's machine guns engaged them in the open riverbed. The Germans tried to deploy into extended formation. Company H's mortars caught them packed between the high banks before they could spread out. Round after round dropped into the channel. The Americans estimated they destroyed 70 of the 100. The survivors ran. That was the last ground attack from the south. The sector stayed quiet until nightfall. Fries wasn't finished. He was deliberately weakening his Naso Ridge positions to feed troops into the fight for the highway. He had no choice. If Bernard's men held Monte Cipolla and the highway stayed cut, the bulk of the 29th Panzergrenadier Division couldn't withdraw east. Hube's entire evacuation timetable for Sicily would crack open, and the German northern sector, 2 Panzergrenadier divisions, could be trapped with their backs to the sea. Colonel Walter Kruger, commanding the 71st Panzergrenadier Regiment on the ridge, received orders to scrape together a battalion for an attack across the Naso River from the west, while Pollack pressed from the east. Kruger peeled off what he could spare and left the rest of his regiment in place to delay Truscott's infantry, the same infantry now racing to reach Bernard. He turned one of his attached field artillery battalions around and began firing eastward toward his own division's escape route. The 29th Panzergrenadier Division was now shooting in 2 directions at once, west to hold the ridge, east to open the highway. Every gun Fries aimed at Bernard was 1 less gun facing Truscott, and Truscott needed every break he could get. At 10:25, Admiral Davidson made the decision that changed everything on that hilltop. The Philadelphia and her escort destroyers set a course for Palermo. Davidson had attended to all prearranged targets. No further fire requests had come in after the truck convoy shoot. He figured Bernard's 2 field artillery batteries could handle the situation. Allied air cover was guaranteed only until noon, and without fighter protection, the cruiser was exposed to Luftwaffe attack. The warships turned west and headed for port. Nobody told Bernard. Nobody told Truscott. The sea went empty. Truscott had been monitoring the situation from Terra Nova through Captain Miller's radio reports, and those reports had been reassuring all morning. Beachhead holding, counterattacks repelled, casualties manageable. Truscott's real anxiety was the ridge itself. His regiments were grinding forward through minefields and German delaying positions, and the gap to Bernard was closing at a crawl. Every unit Truscott had committed at first light was in contact, pushing east, fighting for ridgelines one at a time. The advance wasn't fast enough, and Truscott knew it. At 1100, Pollack assembled a real striking force inside Brolo. 2 infantry companies mounted on personnel carriers, plus several tanks from east of town. He began probing westward toward Company E's position along the Brolo River. Snipers and machine guns moved into the stone buildings overlooking the river, keeping steady fire on the single American platoon guarding the highway bridge. At 11:40, Bernard keyed his radio and asked for airstrikes and naval gunfire on Brolo. The message hit Truscott's command post hard. Truscott didn't know the Philadelphia was gone. He couldn't understand why Bernard was requesting naval support when the ships were supposed to be right there. Staff officers scrambled to telephone 7th Army headquarters. 20 minutes later, Bernard called again. He needed the division's Long Tom 155mm guns, the only artillery with enough range to reach Brolo from the far side of the ridge. Truscott ordered the Long Toms to open fire. Brolo sat at the extreme limit of their range. Every round was a question mark. Truscott renewed his requests for the Navy and the Air Force through 7th Army. The 32nd Air Support Command promised a mission. They wouldn't say when or how many planes. At 13:05, Bernard radioed, "Situation critical." At 13:40, "Enemy counterattacking fiercely. Do something." And at the same time, unknown to Bernard, Truscott was also sending his own urgent messages upward, calling 7th Army for any available air, any available warship, anything with enough firepower to keep 650 men alive until his infantry could claw through the last miles of the Nassau Ridge. Those 4 words from Bernard, "Do something," were the sound of Patton's bet, arriving at the table where somebody else had to cover it. Bernard was stranded behind a Panzergrenadier Division. His mule train was dead on the hillside. His mortar ammunition was almost gone. The Navy had left without telling anyone. The Air Force hadn't shown up, and the nearest friendly infantry was still hours away on the wrong side of a mined ridge. Every condition Truscott had laid out to Patton the evening before, the gap too wide, the link-up too slow, the force too small, was now the situation on the ground. The Philadelphia was almost in Palermo Harbor when Davidson got the flash. He turned the cruiser around, took 2 destroyers, and pushed back east at full speed. By 1400, the Philadelphia's guns were hammering Brolo again. At almost the same moment, 12 A-36 fighter bombers, the ground attack variant of the P-51 Mustang, arrived and dropped bombs on the town and the assembly areas east of it. 30 minutes later, 12 more A-36 swept in and strafed Pollack's scattered infantry. The combined fire broke the German force apart. Pollack's men ran for cover. 3 German tanks crawled into the shelter of Brolo's stone buildings and stayed there, undamaged, waiting. At 15:05, the Shore Fire Control Party's radio link with the Philadelphia went dead. Davidson, unable to communicate with anyone on the ground, unwilling to fire without spotters this close to friendlies, and watching his air cover window close, withdrew the warships for a second time. The Philadelphia had been back for about an hour. Now the horizon was empty again. If you've ever wondered what wears down a unit faster than being forgotten, it's being rescued, and then unrescued twice in the same day. Every time Davidson's cruiser appeared off the coast, the men on Monte Cipolla watched 6-inch shells tear into Pollack's positions and knew the pressure was lifting. Every time the ship turned and steamed west, they watched their heaviest firepower disappear over the horizon and had to restart the math. How many mortar rounds left? How many belts for the machine guns? How many hours until the division breaks through? Hope that arrives and leaves on someone else's schedule is harder to survive than no hope at all. No hope lets you settle into the fight you've got. Hope on a timer keeps ripping you out of it. Back in Terra Nova, Truscott left his command post and drove forward to the 30th Infantry's position on the coastal flats. The regiment had started crossing the Cipolla River at 14:20 under a smokescreen laid down by chemical mortars. The 1st Battalion hit booby-trapped terrain immediately and crawled through it yard by yard. The 3rd Battalion kept pace on the right, slowed by the same obstacles. The 7th Infantry renewed its attack at 1500, straight up the western slopes of the ridge and bogged down in more minefields reinforced by sporadic German artillery and just enough infantry fire to prevent a rush. Kruger's remaining defenders on the ridge knew exactly what they were doing, not trying to stop the Americans permanently, just slowing them enough to buy time for the highway fight east of the Nassau. Truscott called Colonel Sherman and told him to forget Nassau, forget the town, forget any objective that wasn't directly on the path to Bernard. Push east, fast, don't stop for anything. The gap was closing, not fast enough. On Monte Cipolla, Bernard could see Pollack's men regrouping in the buildings below. The 3 surviving German tanks sat near the stone structures on the east side of the Brolo River, engines idling. Bernard's 8 self-propelled howitzers in the Lemon Grove, Battery A East, Battery B West, were now the only heavy firepower between those tanks and the 650 men Patton had sent here. The mortars on the hilltop were down to harassing fire. The machine guns were counting belts. The 3 German tanks that had survived every airstrike and naval bombardment rolled out of Brolo's stone buildings and crossed the Brolo River. Behind them came German infantry. The single American platoon guarding the highway bridge scattered. Most of the men ran toward the beach to link up with the platoon at the railroad bridge. The tanks turned west onto the highway and started moving slowly through the American perimeter. Battery B tried to engage with direct fire. A high stone wall near the bridge blocked the gunners' line of sight. They couldn't see the approaching tanks, and the howitzers couldn't depress enough to clear the wall. The German tanks spotted Battery B trying to reposition and opened fire from the highway. 2 howitzers went first, then 2 ammunition half-tracks. The shells inside cooked off in a chain of explosions that drove the surviving crews away from the remaining guns, scrambling for cover in the Lemon Grove. 1 gun crew refused to leave. They came back to their howitzer, muscled it around, and hauled it onto the highway itself, positioning it just past a bend in the road where the approaching armor couldn't see it. The lead German tank came around the same bend. Both crews fired, both missed. The American gun crew reloaded, the tank crew reloaded. The second rounds left their barrels at almost the same instant. Both hit. The howitzer and the tank caught fire simultaneously, the American crew scrambling clear on one side of the road, the German hull burning on the other. From the hilltop above, Company F watched the whole thing and poured rifle fire down onto the remaining 2 tanks. Rifle rounds bounced off armor plate. Battery A, positioned on the far side of the perimeter, had been fighting to get a firing angle on the tanks. The battery finally managed it, put a round into the second tank, and set it on fire. The 3rd tank, the last one, reversed slowly back toward Brolo. Before it recrossed the river, it paused long enough to put a shell into Battery B's last remaining howitzer, the unmanned one the crew had abandoned when the ammunition half-tracks exploded. The gun was destroyed. The German infantry followed the surviving tank back across the river. Bernard still had Battery A's 4 howitzers in the Lemon Grove. That was his last heavy firepower. Company H's mortars on the hilltop had almost nothing left to shoot. Then the air support Bernard had been begging for arrived, and finished the job the Germans couldn't. At roughly 1600, 7 A-36 swept in low over Monte Cipolla. The pilots weren't properly oriented to the ground below. 2 bombs landed directly on Bernard's command post on the hilltop. 19 men went down, some of them the communications personnel Bernard needed to stay in contact with Truscott. The rest of the bombs hit Battery A's positions in the Lemon Grove. All 4 howitzers were destroyed. Bernard's own air support had just wiped out his last artillery. The men he'd radioed do something about, the men who'd finally come, had hit him instead of the Germans. When the smoke cleared over the Lemon Grove, Company F's soldiers looked down from the highway at 4 wrecked howitzers and the craters where Battery A's gun crews had been standing moments earlier. In the command post on the hilltop, 19 men were down and the radios were damaged. Bernard took stock. No artillery, no mortars worth firing, 5 tanks that hadn't been able to move since they hit the beach at 0400. Machine guns and rifles, and not enough ammunition for a sustained fight against what was still assembling in Brolo. Bernard ordered everyone off the flats and up onto Monte Cipolla. Company F, which had come down the hill to reinforce the Brolo River line, now reversed course and started climbing back up, under German fire the entire way, losing men on the slope. The artillerymen, the engineers, the remnants of Company E's platoons that had been scattered by the tank attack, everyone still able to move, climbed the hill and dug in alongside the infantry already on the summit. Bernard passed the word. If relief didn't come by morning, the men on Monte Cipolla would break into small groups at first light and try to filter back toward the 3rd Division's lines. He figured this was where they'd make their last stand, or their last attempt to get out. The Philadelphia appeared off the coast one more time. A shore fire control officer commandeered a WWII and motored out to the cruiser to re-establish communications. Through a mix-up, 3 other WKWs, loaded with the battalion's remaining ammunition, followed him out to sea. A 5th WKW went after the 3 to bring them back. Most of Bernard's ammunition supply was now bobbing in the Tyrrhenian Sea, heading toward a cruiser. Davidson opened fire on Cape Orlando and Brolo, keeping his shells well clear of Monte Cipolla. 15 minutes later, 8 German aircraft jumped the 3 American warships. In a violent 30-minute fight, the Philadelphia and her destroyers shot down 7 of the 8. Davidson, battered and out of communication with the shore, set course for Palermo a 3rd and final time. The sea went empty for good. The sun was going down. At 1900, Captain Miller, Truscott's liaison officer with Bernard, sent one last partial message requesting naval support, then destroyed his radio set before climbing Monte Cipolla. Only part of the transmission reached Terranova. Truscott, staring at the silent radio, concluded the worst. In his memoir, he wrote that he could see the final German assault swarming over our gallant comrades. Both the 7th and 30th Infantry Regiments had reported losing contact with their leading battalions. The units had outrun their own communications pushing east. Truscott didn't know his regiments had already gained the Naso Ridge by 2200 and were starting down the eastern slopes. Truscott also didn't know that Bernard's force was still alive on the hilltop, battered, nearly out of ammunition, scattered across the summit in small clusters, with some of Company E's survivors still down in the flats, unable to climb the hill, dug into drainage ditches and behind stone walls, fighting German patrols with rifles and hand grenades as the last light faded. At 2200, Colonel Kruger began pulling the 71st Panzergrenadier Regiment eastward along the coastal highway. The German vehicles drove past the base of Monte Cipolla in the dark. Bernard's men, the men Patton had sent to block that highway, lay on the hilltop and listened to the trucks, the half-tracks, the tanks rolling east beneath them. The trap had been set directly on the enemy's escape route. The enemy drove through it. The force on the hill was too spent, too low on ammunition, and too far from reinforcement to stop them. Kruger's regiment reached the first phase line east of Pirino, 3 miles beyond Brolo, and linked up with General Roth's forces, withdrawing from Randazzo. The escape route stayed open. At 0730 on August 12th, Bernard heard small arms fire from the west, the sound of the 1st Battalion, 30th Infantry, pushing into the flats below. He sent a patrol down. It made contact with a 1st Battalion patrol at the base of the hill. Bernard rescinded his order for the men to break into small groups and filter back to friendly lines. His force, minus 177 men who'd been on that hilltop 24 hours earlier, came down off Monte Cipolla. Patton never climbed it. 177 men paid the bill on a hill the man who ordered the operation would never see. The view from the summit of Monte Cipolla and the view from 7th Army headquarters were of two different wars, fought at two different prices. Generals are allowed to make decisions that cost other men their lives. That's the job. The question that follows a commander home isn't whether the cost was high, it's whether the cost bought what he said it would buy. 6 days later, on August 17th, Patton drove into Messina. He'd won his horse race. The 7th Army arrived before Montgomery's 8th. Patton's jeep rolled through the streets, and American flags went up over the port. The record would show that the United States Army had beaten the British to the finish line. Truscott was already there. He'd reached Messina ahead of Patton, and then he waited. For 2 hours, the man Patton had called afraid to fight stood in the city and let his commanding general arrive first. Out of respect for his superior, Truscott later wrote, out of the chain of command. The general who'd been right about Brolo, who'd thrown his entire division into the ridge to save the men he'd warned Patton not to send, who'd spent 30 hours listening to radio calls he couldn't answer. That general stood aside and gave the man who'd overruled him the privilege of entering the city first. The 29th Panzergrenadier Division had withdrawn east with most of its heavy equipment intact. Hube's evacuation timetable had been disrupted by 24 hours, 1 day. Bernard's landing had forced Fries off the Nassau Ridge a day early, no small thing given the position's natural strength. That was the tactical gain. The Green Book, the official U.S. Army history, weighed the result and delivered its judgment. If a stronger force had landed, at least a full regimental combat team, and if continuous naval and air support had been maintained, Fries could hardly have cleared a way out along the coastal highway. The entire German northern flank might have been rolled up and cut off from Messina. The operation came close to working. Close doesn't hold a highway. The same history closed the chapter with a sentence that sits like a headstone. Bernard's landing accomplished little. Bernard's battalion received the Distinguished Unit Citation, the same award given to the most heavily engaged units in the war. Bernard himself received the Silver Star. The Philadelphia expended 1,062 6-inch rounds in a single day, sailing back and forth along the Sicilian coast 3 times to keep those men alive. Admiral Davidson's crews fought off 8 German aircraft in one 30-minute engagement alone. The effort to save Bernard's force was enormous. The force itself was too small for the job Patton gave it. And the other thing that happened on August 10th, Patton's eruption at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, the slap that would surface in November and nearly destroy his career, cast a longer shadow over his command than anything that happened on Monte Cipolla. The horse race, the hilltop, the 177 men, all of it disappeared under the weight of a different headline. Patton won Messina. He lost something larger on the same day he ordered Brolo, and it had nothing to do with a hill.